All right, let's dive into a really fascinating critique from the YouTube channel Revolutionary Thinking. They've got this take on a certain kind of super rich person, the ones who seem to have these incredibly fragile egos. We're going to break down their whole argument.
So let me just start by asking you this, because the source kicks off with this exact question. Seriously, think about it. If money was no object forever, would you quit your job? Would you move somewhere new? Would you finally leave a bad situation? This question, it gets right to the heart of what we're talking about today. What's the real point of having all that money?
So here's how we're going to unpack this whole thing. First, we'll look at their big idea about money and ego. Then, we'll get into the media's role in all this. After that, we'll tackle some of their harshest critiques, and we'll wrap up with the hopeful vision they offer at the end.
Okay, first things first. Let's dig into the core idea here. The argument from revolutionary thinking is that the true power of money, well, it isn't what you might think. It's not about fame or fancy stuff. It's about something way more fundamental.
And that fundamental thing is options. That's the key word. It's the real freedom to completely change your life. The power to decide where you live, what you do, who you're with. The source argues that this is the real dream for most people, not just owning things, but having total control over your own story. And this is where they draw a really sharp line in the sand. On one side, you have the promise of wealth, which is all about freedom, change, making a real impact. But then on the other side, you have what they call the reality for a certain group. It all gets poured into propping up a fragile ego, with publicists, TV interviews, the whole media blitz. Now, it is super important to be clear about this. The source is not attacking all wealthy people. Not at all. In fact, they give a shout out to the rich people who use their money to do good things, usually quietly, behind the scenes. No, this critique is aimed squarely at the ones who seem to create, in their words, drama and insanity just to keep the spotlight on themselves.
So, how does this whole thing keep going? Well, that brings us to the second part of the argument, the engine that keeps this cycle running. And that's the celebrity-obsessed media culture that we all live in. The source describes it as an ugly feedback loop, and it kind of works like this. Our culture worships celebrities and the super rich, which means the media covers their every move. That constant attention then encourages those same people to perform for the cameras, manage their image, and air their personal drama, which of course just feeds our obsession even more. And around we go.
And this leads to a really powerful question they pose. With all this media attention, all the oxygen in the room, so to speak, being sucked up by this tiny group of people, who are we not hearing from? The argument is that this massive platform could be given to people with brilliant ideas, or maybe even people who are just genuinely suffering and need to be heard. To really get at this imbalance, the source brings up this brilliant concept they call freedom of reach. This is a game changer. It's not about your right to say something, it's about your actual ability to get a massive audience to hear it. And this just lays it out perfectly. Look, we all have freedom of speech, that's a given, but very, very few people have freedom of reach. Not many people have the keys to the media megaphone. And the source finds it pretty grotesque when that massive power is used to talk about personal spots instead of, huge systemic problems. Okay, so now we're going to get into the sharpest edge of this whole critique. The source really doesn't pull any punches here and singles out two groups that they see as the absolute worst offenders. First up, the argument gets way, way more intense when it comes to people who built their fortunes by, as the source puts it, grifting from people. For this group, they argue that all the public ego defending isn't just annoying, it's a deep insult to the very people they exploited to get rich. And this is a direct quote from the source, and wow. It's pretty stark. It paints this picture of wealth that isn't just earned, but is built on the ashes of other people's hopes and dreams. And from that perspective, complaining about your public image, well, it just seems incredibly hollow. The second group they put under the microscope, celebrity politicians. The argument here is that when someone in public service starts acting like a celebrity, their priorities get all twisted. It becomes less about serving the people and more about being worshipped and protecting their own ego. So, when you boil it all down, the source presents this really simple moral compass. You've got the villain, who wants to be worshipped and served by others, and then you have the hero, who is just helpful, selfless. It's a very clear way to judge how someone is using their power and influence. But after all that heavy criticism, the video doesn't just leave you there. The final part actually shifts gears. It moves away from just tearing things down and starts to propose a really constructive, hopeful vision for the future. And this is the big challenge they throw down. Instead of pouring all this time, money, and energy into what they see as ego-driven drama and tribal politics, what if we redirected all of that toward a much bigger, much more ambitious goal? And that huge goal is what they call a post-scarcity world. So what does that actually mean? Well, they define it as a society where everyone's basic needs are met: food, shelter, safety. The idea is that if you free people from that constant, nagging existential dread, you give them a real shot at reaching their full potential. So the argument presents us with a really clear choice. It's like we're at a fork in the road. We can keep going down this path of focusing on individual egos, on clout, on political infighting, or we can make a collective choice to pivot and start solving these massive, fundamental human problems. This final quote really it perfectly captures the raw frustration at the heart of the source's whole argument. It's a powerful critique of using influence not to empower other people, but to just gather a bunch of followers whose only job is to defend one person's ego. And in the end, this is the question that revolutionary thinking leaves us with. It reframes our attention, what we watch, who we listen to, not as something passive, but as a valuable resource that we are actively investing. And so it asks, pretty pointedly, based on where we're putting that investment right now, are we really getting a good return? Something to think about.